Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Welcome everybody, may peace and blessings be upon you all. We know there's a lot of things to be doing on a Friday night, but really appreciate it from both Unizobi MSA and UAAH that you're all attending this debate. Now I don't want to take too much of your time. We'll start the event as soon as possible. Just want to say a few things about Islamic Awareness Week and a few housekeeping rules, and then we'll just begin. So, it's such a relief to finally be here. Every year, the MSA is not just the one on our campus in Unizobi, but in every uni. We hold an Islamic Awareness Week. We're trying to spread the message of Islam, holding events, lectures, debates such as this one, and I'm hoping that almost all of you guys have seen us on the library walkway. So yeah, it's a relief to be here tonight. So the topic tonight is Has Science Killed God? And I'm just going to introduce the speakers now, then go over some small things and then we'll begin. So tonight we have Dan Hageman and Raghib Siddiqui. Now, I'm just going to read out the... Well, since we're having, PowerPoints, might as well just make it a bit better, like not your usual stuff. So I'm just going to read out the bio that was put online. So, okay. Dan is an engineer from America who recently completed his PhD in biomedical engineering from UNSW. While his focus in the engineering sciences has remained consistent throughout his academic career, from the likes of neutral interfacing to that of physiological mapping and mechanical characterization of medical textiles, Dan spends the large majority of his spare time studying philosophy, attending various religious and irreligious organizational events, and running an intellectual God discussion group at one of the Unizobi residential communities where he also serves as the assistant dean. So that's Dan, that's our first speaker. And for Raghib, now, most people... Sorry, probably a bit awkward for you too, but... So most people know Raghib as the passionate mathematics educator. He's currently teaching Extension 1 and Extension 2 mathematics streams at Alpha Omega Senior College, a top 40 school in New South Wales, and has recently started a company called Al Jabr Mathematics, which I'm guessing a lot of the Muslims in the crowd know about, named in tribute to Islam's contribution to mathematics. But what many people don't know about Raghib is that alongside his advanced mathematics, he's also studied philosophy, political theory, and international relations at USyd. So, not at such a good university, I mean here it's better, but not bad. So his final year research project was on the role that the contemporary human rights regime had in otherizing Islamists and other Muslims who don't subscribe to a secular worldview. He's received a scholarship to study postgraduate law, which he's dropped to pursue his passion for teaching. So this is the structure of the night. We're going to have Dan first. He's going to present his case for 20 minutes, and then immediately we're going to have Raghib present his case, and then we're going to have a break. So these timings, we're trying to be optimistic. Hopefully we stick by them. Let's be real, we're not going to stick by them. It's always going to go a little bit over, but let's try to stick with them. So I'll be constantly, just keeping you guys updated with the timings and all that sort of stuff. So we're going to have a break, and then we're going to come back, hopefully after 10 minutes, to have a cross-examination, and that's where Raghib and Dan will both be asking each other questions, quizzing each other on what they had just said, and basically the rebuttals and all that sort of stuff. And then we'll have a Q&A. We'll open it up to the audience, and then we'll end it. So we'll have closing remarks from both of them, and I also have some things to plug in at the end. So good times coming up. So just the last few things. For those who don't know, bathroom is just, so you exit here, it's on the same floor, you go to your right, and then you turn right again. And then you should find the male and the female toilets. And refreshments, so in our break, now we have good refreshments from chicken nuggets and spring rolls to like cakes and like all this sort of stuff. So definitely, go outside when it's refreshing, so don't just sit there like a weirdo. And an important thing, there will be a chance for anonymous questions. So yes, we'll be taking some from the audience, but there will also be a chance for anonymous questions, and I'll be explaining that as we, proceeding to the night. And just the last thing, there's going to be a lot of pictures being taken throughout the night. If you don't want to be in a picture, then just let myself know at the end of the event, or let one of the photographers know, or one of the exec team members from either society. And yeah, without further ado, Dan, you can come up.
All right, you talking into this? Is that how we're doing it? All right, guys. Yes, so thank you for the introduction, Irfan. As you said, awesome, huge shout out to UNSW, MSA, as well as everyone in UA who helped put tonight together. It's an honor to speak here. I've never done a formal debate tonight. This will be my first time, but hopefully you guys would have never guessed that by the time I get done with it. So a few things I wanted to clarify for this debate just before we get started. I think one thing that we're all going to converge on tonight are the importance of conversations like these. I know Raghav and I talked briefly on the phone, and that seemed to be something that we both agree on. So that speaks really highly to those of you that have come out. Another thing is that we need to be aware of is that as someone who's always more of a conversationalist, like my fellow interlocutor here, I think we are generally skeptical of debates because oftentimes they seem to be caring about who's right rather than what's right. And I'm hoping tonight that we can really target where we're different and diverging in our ideas, and we can focus more on the evidence and justified beliefs or lack thereof, rather than who was able to win an argument or falsify someone else's claims. And then lastly, I think it stands for both Raghav and myself, speaking a lot for you tonight already, both of us are just individuals up here. So everything I say about atheism is not necessarily going to be representative of atheism, particularly because we don't have a core tenets like many of the Abrahamic religions do. And I'm sure the same is for him. So just keep that in mind as we go things. There might be things you disagree with or agree with. I just think those are good to keep in mind. So, has science killed God? Yes. I think after you've considered all of the evidence, to me this comes across as a no-brainer. But because we have quite a bit of time to go through it, I think it's important that we clarify the question in a way that makes a bit more sense. So, to do this, has science killed God? The first problem with this, at least from my point of view, is that there's a false presupposition that God existed and he's therefore been killed. Now, don't get me wrong, I totally understand that debates like this, we're trying to sell tickets, we're trying to get an audience. This is the kind of stuff that brings you guys here. That's totally fine. We're living in a world of clickbait. We know how it works. But I think it's just important to clarify the way we need to actually tackle these issues when we're seriously thinking about them. So the idea that God existed and was killed probably isn't the best place to start. The other thing that this seems to do is it shifts the burden of proof. And I know as an atheist, a lot of my fellow atheist friends often have this issue, is that it seems like it's always, did science kill God? Or can science disprove God? It seems like the titles are never, does science affirm God and allow the theist to speak in the affirmative first? It seems like this burden of proof is always changing. And the last problem is it's kind of a misunderstanding when we think about what it means to really kill an idea. Would you guys say that science has killed flat earth theory? Perhaps not. We have thousands of people that still believe in it, right? Maybe that's not the right question. It might be, it's a common quote. Everyone likes to go back to Friedrich Nietzsche, God is dead, right? But I think they're kind of misunderstanding what he meant there. He was talking specifically about society. So when we think about this stuff, the question is there compatibility or incompatibility between religion, in this case the belief in an Abrahamic God, and scientific epistemology / claims of science? So to break this question down, the way I think is best to do it is we ask, is there a conflict between religion and science in methodology and or conclusions? So that's about epistemology and how we come to know the truth. And then the second question is, while religious belief may certainly be understandable, is it actually justified in an objective sense? And now what I'm not claiming, which some people often confuse, is that one cannot be religious and a scientist. We all well know that there's been many of them. I myself was a Christian for the first almost half a century or quarter of a century of my life. And I was a scientist that whole time, and I felt it was completely justified. During my PhD candidature here, one of my lab mates, who I worked quite closely with and I'm good friends of, she's a very devout Christian, right? And in a lot of ways, she's a lot better at science than I am, right? So it's not that I'm saying you can't have both of these things. my contention is that you're going to have to compartmentalize them when you walk into the lab, when you perform experiments. If you're constantly thinking about, oh, was there, perchance a miraculous effect in my experiment, maybe that accounts for the error. We don't see these paragraphs in any of the journals, right? Would we have different error bars for the different faiths and how ridiculous they might be? No, right? It's crazy to imagine. We put these notions aside and faith-based claims when we come into the realm of objectivity and making claims about reality. So, the incompatibility of science and faith. The way I'm going to kind of lay out this presentation is I'm first going to focus just generally on the epistemological contradictions between faith-based and science-based claims. So again, that's how we come to know these truth claims that are being made. And then I'm going to cover a couple key examples where I think science has really shown contradictory results to those that are implied/necessary to relevant religious beliefs. Okay, and before I jump into that, because I'm not going to actually be covering these in my opening point, I just wanted to throw them out there so that no one thought I was actually avoiding some of the common arguments that we see brought up by theists. So just quickly through those. The first one is that our cosmological understanding of the universe and its origins provides scientific evidence for the truth of theism. The universe is clearly fine-tuned to an astronomical degree for our existence and points to the likelihood of a creator. Without a God, there are no objective moral values available to navigate the world in which we live. And lastly, that without a God, there is no meaning in life. So again, I'm not going to be covering these in my opening here, but these are things I want to cover during our cross-examination, and if not, during the Q&A with you guys. So don't think I'm avoiding them. Just because I'm opening, I thought I'd start with some new stuff. So to get things going, the disparate conclusions and epistemology. So why are we having a conversation tonight about the compatibility of science and religion? Right? Does anyone ever ask, are sports and science or sports and religion compatible? No one asks this, right? The reason is because both of these individual epistemologies are making claims about reality. Whether it's a figure existing like Jesus or Muhammad or anything, or a virgin birth, these are claims about reality that are falsifiable, right? And that's why these things start to conflict. The second is the pollution of science by superstition. Depending where you live, it's going to have different impacts on your society. Things like the lack of education about evolution, sexual health, things like this, at least in the United States where I'm from, these things are pervasive throughout our education systems, largely because of the lack of secularization and religion finding a way to pollute the science. Thirdly, the narrow definition that theism often gives to science. Now this is something that I see very common, and I think we're working too narrowly with our definition of science here. Science isn't just someone in a lab coat running experiments with test tubes, right? It's more than just biology, chemistry, physics, all of those major disciplines, right? The lines between philosophy and even history and any of these epistemic systems of analysis, these actually aren't that fine. Logic, all of these things apply. So anyone who's saying that, science could never tell you, how you should act in a society or what government you should have, well, no one's making the claim that only experiments in the lab can do this. That's to conflate empirical evidence with scientific methodology itself. Fourth, there's the broad and flexible definition given to God. And this is something I think is fairly obvious if you just look at the number of different definitions we get for God and theism. Look at how many numbers of faiths there have been over the year and how many of them make mutually exclusive claims. They obviously can't all be right. And that's because they have to make it flexible to actually fit with all the data and all the things we're learning about the universe. When someone says God is perfect goodness and almighty, right? These are things that they're so broad where they can't really be falsified. And then lastly, religious knowledge is absolute while science is relative. Science is the first epistemology or group of people to let you know when they're wrong. This is why we have peer-reviewed methodology. This is why we check things. This is why science doesn't change its mind. Our understanding of science changes, and that's how we improve. This is something that's a lot harder to do in religion, especially if you start talking about absolute knowledge of something. So moving briefly into the examples. I'm going to just touch on evolution and the teleological argument, which is basically the argument that there's design and purpose in the world. And now, this might seem like low-hanging fruit, because a lot of people don't actually believe that the world is 6,000 years old and that evolution has no place in science, right? Some people still do, but this is something that needs to be touched on because we've seen how much of an impact Darwin and the discovery of how species come to be has had on society. So if you just look at this graph here on the right, you can kind of see in the blue in the top, we have Iceland and Denmark, and it goes down to 34 different countries. And in blue is the people that accept evolution as true, right? And we can see that it kind of decreases. My country, United States, is right there, and it's second to the bottom. To me, that's a little embarrassing, right? Right below that is Turkey, which I believe is considered an Islamic country. Correct me if I'm wrong. But aside from that, I actually don't think, unfortunately, there are any other Islamic countries on here. So I'm going to kind of relay that to you guys to give me a general perception of the way that Islam sees evolution. Again, most of my experience is with Christianity, so if I misappropriate anything towards general theism, please don't hesitate to let me know. So if you just look at some of the statistics, I mean, 40% believe that people were directly created by God, another 38% evolution is guided by God, and only 16% accept evolution from earlier species. And this is the view of almost every scientist in evolutionary biology that's accepted in peer-reviewed, respectable journals today, right? This is a problem. Now, why it might not be your belief, and it's definitely, perhaps misinterpretations of other people's scriptures by these people that are filling out these polls this way, this is a problem, right? And it can't just be a coincidence that it's religion that correlates so strongly with this. And if you actually look at the statistics of what should be taught in school, they get even worse. So one more thing briefly about evolution. Now, most Christians that I interact with regularly, they accept evolution. They accept it as true. They kind of get wishy-washy when they explain God's role in it. But my issue with evolution, when they do accept this, is that I still find it incompatible with the claims of faith. So the way that evolution generally works is that there's really no first human. The idea of a first member of a species is nonsensical, right? If I was, or my wife was to give birth to the first human, that human would have no species to procreate with, right? It would die right away. It's a gradual thing that after you look at different epochs of time, there's been enough differentiation to the point where there's no longer procreation consistently possible and we deem them to be new species, right? If there's no first human, where does our soul come from? The soul can't be gradual, I presume, right? So did God just insert the soul by some miraculous intervention like he does in many other cases? That could be possible. But then why does God give it to that first human that he deems to be human and not his parents? Where's the justice there? And then thirdly, the problem that you run into is it's really hard to get an objective justification for why only humans should have souls and other species shouldn't. And that's not to say that there aren't clear differences between humans and our abilities of cognition, rationality, emotion, even our various variety of conscious states, right? And all of these have massive moral implications. But it starts to get a little confusing where you say, okay, they have souls and other animals don't. Now again, please correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misinterpreting the way that this stuff is explained in other versions of theism, etc. Okay, so moving on from evolution, one thing that I really wanted to tackle tonight, because I think it gets talked about way too little, is this issue of free will. And the reason is, for me, as someone who went from being a believer to a non-believer, to me this is one of the biggest barriers. If I had to try and picture myself ever believing again, this seems like a logical barrier that you can't get by. Whereas if you look at issues like suffering in the world, right, and the problem of evil, to me, those are highly indicative that we don't have an all-loving or an all-just God who's sovereign over us. To me, it all seems to point one way. But it's not logically impossible. It's totally possible that this God, for reasons unbeknownst to us, is going to balance this out in some sort of karma way with eternal salvation or punishment, right? That's totally possible, and we just may be unaware of it. So that's not a logical issue. But my issue with free will is that it is. And I think if I'm successfully able to demonstrate to you why it's very clear that the free will, the kind that matters, doesn't exist, then logically you can't have a judgmental God who's going to reward or punish someone eternally. And it also undermines his character. So quick definitions there. Libertarian free will, which is the one that most denominations of various theistic religions seem to withhold, because I think it's necessary to justify the way God treats us by different eschatologies and things like that. And this is the ability to have acted other than how you acted. Right? And this differs from determinism, which is events, including moral choices, are determined, precluding the idea that one could have acted otherwise. So I'm a determinist, right? And that doesn't mean that I don't see any degree of freedom in things. There's a difference if I jump off of this desk and Ragib throws me off it, right? I see that, right? So it's useful in the way that we communicate, but I recognize that each of those situations, it was destined to happen just because of the way the laws of physics work. So, and also just to mention the prevalence in professional philosophy. Now, as Sean Carroll says, if you get 5 philosophers in the room, they're not going to agree on how many philosophers are in the room, right? But if you actually look, you look at how many people accept determinism, and this includes compatibilism, which accepts determinism and then redefines free will. It's almost 80%. These kind of statistics are almost unheard of in professional philosophy. There's such a range of belief systems. And about 11% accept or lead towards this libertarianism, which coincidentally starts to correlate with the amount of professional philosophers who are also theists. So, the scientific problems with free will, where does science really come in here? Well, first we have psychology. Everyone knows that we're vulnerable to manipulation to some extent, whether directly or whether subconsciously. So there's been various studies. They look at the subconscious influence of the environment, your genetic influence, personality, and moral behavior. One experiment they did, they brought people in and they gave them, cheers. They gave them different vacation destinations to choose from, right? They were told the rules and said, you have this place you can go and this place. And they were asked, which place would you like to go? And then they were asked why they chose the one they did. And they always gave these great reasons, it's because my grandmother grew up there, etc. But it turns out that it was actually because based on the temperature of the drink that they were served while they were answering the survey, if they had a cold drink, they ended up taking the warmer places. And if they had a warm drink, they took the colder place. This was completely unbeknownst to them. They had no idea that they were being manipulated. So we definitely have this illusion that we're free, but it can't actually be argued that it's there. I've only got 5 minutes left or so, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. So neuroscience, there's been several experiments. So Libet in '83 did an EEG study, and Chun Seong Soon did one with fMRIs, which are a bit more technologically advanced. And basically what they showed is that the things that take place between your neurotransmitters and the firing across different synapses in your brain, these things occur up to 10 seconds prior to you actually being conscious of making a decision, right? If this isn't poking at free will, it's almost drop kicking it. Right? If a scientist can predict what you're going to do before you consciously have made up your mind, on what grounds are you saying that you still have that free will? And lastly, I think the most interesting studies are those of split brain patients. So these are people who have had their corpus callosum cut in half. And this is usually to treat epilepsy and seizures and things like this. And what you find is that these people, because we communicate via speech and language with the left side of our brain generally, and writing and visual stuff with the right side, you can ask one person the same question, and depending on whether or not they write the answer or speak the answer, they have 2 completely mutually exclusive answers. So there's actually patients that are theists on one side of the brain and atheists on the opposite. This brings up a lot of philosophical and theological problems, right? Where does this person go when they die, right? Which one is them? Right? It's easy when the brains are communicating and correcting one another, but which one's really them? How do you deal with this, right? So the philosophical problems of free will are similar to those, except in the sense it's just thinking about are you really free to do something or control your thoughts? And my main contention is that I'm not free to believe what I want, which might seem crazy, right? And I think every religion that has any sort of judgment is kind of depending on this notion because there's reward and there's punishment. If you're not free to choose what you want, is it just for God to punish you? I would argue not. So if everyone in their mind right now, whether you're a theist or an atheist, try and imagine believing the other thing. Get yourself to do it. I reckon it's pretty hard. And I don't deny that you can't pretend, right? I can pretend to believe that 1 + 1 is 7, but I really just can't get myself to do it. I'm a slave to the rationality that my brain gives me and the brain that God allegedly gave me as well. So any God that's going to give me this brain and then punish me for being vulnerable to it in the way that it works, I just find to be ridiculous. So if you just look at God's character, I'm almost out of time here, so I'll get into that more in the discussion. But it undermines both his omniscience and omnipotence. And if you just look at the things in the eschatological judgments, this is why I think this is a huge thing. We shall send those who reject our revelations to hellfire. When their skins have been burned away, we shall replace them with new ones so that they may continue to feel the pain. God is almighty, all-wise. And there's similar sayings in the Christian Bible. Now, in Islam's defense, I think there's degrees of punishment there, which I find much more appealing for people like myself. But it also does sound a lot worse. But the point is that these questions matter, right? I'm up here, and yes, I could be lying to you right now. But I hope the people that know me, and I know myself, that I'm not lying. I'm just unconvinced of the claims of Islam and theism the same way you're unconvinced of all the other gods. And these are other areas of conflict that maybe we'll discuss later. That's all for now. Thank you.
That was so much information. I didn't eat. My favorite is too much energy. Of course, there's no left. I'm just eating it.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Where'd Dan go? Oh, there he is. Thanks, Dan. Look, to be honest, it was actually really refreshing listening to an atheist and someone of your background as well in mechatronic engineering who actually had a background in philosophy. That's actually something that's very, very refreshing. And I must say, I'm also very impressed by all the work that has been done by the UNSW MSA. You guys are doing a fantastic job. Well done, especially Irfan. And you've kind of shown that the best structure for any organization is definitely having a solid dictator up top. So keep continuing that Middle Eastern legacy and all that stuff. All right, now, I want to start by making it really clear about what it is that I am and am not doing. As weird as it sounds, I'm actually not here to defend my specific religion, Islam, or any specific God for that matter. And my interpretation of the debate is actually that that's not the topic at hand. The topic at hand is the very specific idea, right? And this is my interpretation of the topic, about whether science, as a particular, as Dan said, epistemological method, has eliminated the need for a divine creator. That's where I think the topic actually lies. And so, in other words, for this particular debate, I almost just happen to kind of be Muslim. I would make largely the same points if I was a Christian, whether I was a Jew. And so I'm not really making any arguments that would be fundamentally different to other people of monotheistic denominations, obviously with my own tweaks, contextualizing for Islam. And for that reason, I'm not going to really be clarifying too much about or quelling anyone's anxieties, especially with question and answers, about any of the legal positions that my religion has. That's not the topic of tonight's discussion. The topic of tonight's discussion is this. It's something that's actually bothered me for a good last decade of my life and for the past 10 years that I've been in and out of university, because I've seen it have unquantifiable consequences to a huge amount of people. And that is the monopoly that science and the scientific method has had in really producing legitimate knowledge. And I think this is probably going to be my most important point for the night, which is, when I did my first unit of psychology, one of the first things that psychology tries to do is it tries very hard to differentiate itself from other forms of knowledge pursuing about the human mind. And it says that the only form of legitimate knowledge that we can actually attain about the human mind is through experimentation, is through, you have to have p-values less than 0.05 for everyone that's doing their PhDs. You have to make sure that your experiments are repeatable. Freud was definitely wrong. You have to make sure that your experiments can be, verified. And this idea that science has, which is the element of falsifiability as a criteria, became basically the predominant framework in which we understand science to be. And that has consequences, that has huge amounts of consequences. One of the consequences that if today you find yourself, for example, and I don't mean this as a cheap shot, but if you find yourself clinically depressed and you've done the rounds with psychologists and they're just not working, and you're trying to find, for example, help from alternative sources, things like psychoanalysis, things like alternative forms of mental health therapy, then you're not going to get government funding for those kinds of help. And the reason for that is because it's not deemed as science. It's not deemed to be compatible with what we understand to be a valid and legitimate truth-building enterprise. And that's not just in psychology. You go to political science, you go to international relations, you go to sociology, you go to anthropology, and a lot of these fields in the humanities, they won't take you seriously unless you adopt a specific scientific methodology, right? And for that reason, I think what's at stake here is quite large. I think what's at stake here is not just a question of whether God has killed science, but has science killed all forms of knowledge-building enterprises outside of what it deems to be acceptable? That's, I think, a far larger question that we need to keep in mind. And so that brings me kind of to my first point. And that's why I called my talk, little spiel, Science, God, and the Death of Necessary Truth. Because if there's one thing that science tries, and it has almost successfully done, which is that it has destroyed our capacity to hold necessary truths to our heart. That's really what it's done. And I want to flesh this particular point out. Because, and this is a reality. Reality is that science currently has a monopoly over of legitimate knowledge. And what I'm going to do to best tonight is to show you guys that this monopoly that science has had, this monopoly in producing this legitimate, acceptable form of knowledge, it's not something that science in its whole form actually deserves. And, this idea that we have that there's a scientist sitting up in the ivory tower looking into a microscope funded by a university that only cares about producing amazing knowledge for the sake of knowledge, taking the new frontiers of what human beings can know. And I say this with a lot of sadness, those days are coming to a close, right? Gone are the days where science is this magical endeavor that, you do because you care about the world, and, you just want to gain knowledge. In the modern economy, there's no time for that. There is absolutely no time for that form of science because scientists, they don't just pursue knowledge at all costs. What they do, and it's going to sound, I purposely made this, and I did ask everyone whether this would be okay. Science pours itself, I think, to the highest bidder, right? And this is going to sound incredibly aggressive, but I believe this is 100% true. Because if anyone actually graduates from their PhD, if anyone seeks research grants, you'll actually find that you're not subject to inquiry based on what you actually want to do. A lot of what you end up doing is very simple. You have to find grants, right? Science isn't cheap. Performing science is not just about performing experiments. There's a whole host of different elements that come together, and the relationship between science and the relationship between capital has been something that's been documented for a long time now. And that, I want to make this clear, that doesn't make science and scientists evil. It just makes them human, because science isn't cheap. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the modern development of scientific inquiry is so capital intensive that it's crucial that we understand that science is not this neutral observer of ideas. That's not how science in the modern age works, right? And so here's going to be my key argument. My key argument is going to be that there is, between the relationship of science and capital, science does follow whatever reigning ideology there exists at the time. And right now we might be living in a reigning ideology that sounds quite nice because it proclaims humanist values of rights and the equality of all human beings, but it wasn't always like that, right? There was a time when the reigning ideology was a highly racist system in the mid 40s of the US, just before World War II, when the scientists of the day were convinced, right, and this was widespread, there was a consensus almost that the eugenics program had a particular scientific backing. And that's because science followed the ideology of that particular time. If the reigning ideology happened to be a totalitarian system that, genuinely believed in order to eliminate, in order to progress as a race and as a society, that you need to perform the genocide of several million people, scientists have historically, and this is what we see in the history books, scientists have just asked how efficiently can we do this, right? If the reigning ideology, and this is not just something that's happened in history, this is happening something now, right? If the reigning ideology needs manless drones to blow up some wedding in some village in Pakistan from an air-conditioned room several thousand kilometers away in Dallas, as scientists, it doesn't matter if you think that it's unethical, because if there's enough capital backing it, the pursuit of science will head towards the direction of whatever reigning ideology exists, right? And that's because built into the scientific methodology, I don't think there is any ethical framework that science itself, from its own epistemic methodology, can actually establish, right? And that's I guess why I'm pretty passionate about this. And my key argument is going to be that science's role to establish testable facts about the universe, it has a particular role in doing that, and that science as an epistemic inquiry only has the capacity to test things that we know to be in the universe, that we can actually experiment on, that we can actually observe, that we can actually run experiments on. So that's the first premise that I'm going to make. And the second premise that's going to be is that science has historically had to deal with two big problems. The first problem is the logical validity of inductive reasoning, and the second is therefore the epistemic problem of dealing with science's own basis. And I believe that Popper solved this particular problem of induction, and he solved the problem with the falsifiability criteria, but we've kind of shrugged off the second problem, which is, why is it that science can be seen as something that's a valid truth-making mechanism? And the reason, the philosophers of science have kind of established to this point where they've literally said it works. Right? We're living in a society where science just works. It builds our iPhones, it builds our computers, it builds all the things that we need to operate in life. And so if it works, it must be the most credible way to establish knowledge. And the philosophical consequence of this falsifiability criteria that Popper establishes is that he kind of creates a world where we can no longer have necessary truths. And what do I mean by something that's necessarily true? A necessary truth is something like 1 + 1 = 2. It's something that doesn't change. It's something that it's something that holds itself true, irrespective of the times that we live in. And instead, what we're seeing is we're living in a world of evolving truths. Truths aren't necessarily something that are static anymore. There are things that what can be true today can be false a couple of years down the track. And then my last argument is that from a political and social point of view, the death of necessary truths presents problems that we ought to take extremely, extremely seriously. So, going through it really quickly, I don't think that science and rationality are necessarily, we often conflate them to be the same thing. They are not exactly what science is all about. Science, by and large, right, or specifically the scientific method, I do believe this from the bottom of my heart, is the single greatest man-made device to procure knowledge that is immediate and that is usable about the temporal world. In other words, the world that we can experiment on, the world that we can see, the world that we can observe. But it doesn't really have much to say about the world that is outside of temporality, right? If anything, science simply doesn't have the tools because of the nature of its observation, because of the nature of the testability criterion. It doesn't have the tools to be able to deal with questions outside of time and space. And so my key point here is that science should therefore really be indifferent to questions about things that cannot be perceived, that cannot be tested on. And it also should be indifferent on issues of morality, because as a scientific method, there are it doesn't have the tools within itself to deal with questions about right and wrong. And so when in some senses, there's not really that much that I have to do in terms of the actual debate question at hand, because the question about whether science has killed God may not even be in the realm of what science can and can't do, right? And this actually goes to something that Dan actually said. He said very clearly that there is a shifting in the burden of proof that this particular debate has, and the burden of proof, unfortunately, because of the way the structure of the debate is, does lie on Dan here. Right? It relies on Dan to illustrate why the scientific methodology, why all the sources of knowledge that we come to know through science can actually disprove the existence of a creator. And look, my general issue is that when it comes to the problem of inductive reasoning, there's a history to why science looks the way it does today, right? The first reason is that if we start with a particular theory, it's science, this idea, and this is a famous idea in the philosophy of science, that if we want to show that all swans are white, and that was a particular theory that existed at the time, we can go out and observe 1,000 white swans, right? And we can observe that all 1,000 swans are indeed white. And if we make that observation, it seems to support the claim that all swans are white, right? And as the British settlers found out when they came to Australia, they found that not all swans are white. So that raised a particular problem in how the scientific method works. And Popper's solution for this, Karl Popper was a famous philosopher of science, and he really nailed exactly what science looks like. He nailed this idea of what falsifiability looks like, which is, he said that the best way to prove a scientific theory, and this guy is the kind of, he is the person of authority when it comes to telling us what science is and isn't. Because to this day, most scientists, most practitioners of science do turn to exactly his falsifiability criterion to establish what science is. What he said was the best way to prove that all swans are white are not necessarily to go out and look for things that actually validate and sort of support your argument, but rather to go out and falsify things. That's the key idea. And so instead of going out and looking for swans that you actually want to see white, you do your best to look for non-white swans. And so what you do is you go out into the real world and you say, I've done my absolute best to conduct experiments looking for non-white swans. And so far, I could not find any non-white swans. And therefore, my theory that all swans are white are contingently true until there's evidence to suggest otherwise. Now, modern science simply does not bother with absolute truths. All facts that we understand to be truths, it doesn't proclaim that these are absolute truths, right? And all facts that modern science establishes are contingencies of whatever age, of whatever era, until we know otherwise. And basically, I believe that if we really do believe in a world of contingent truth, it raises a lot of problems when it comes to whether we can establish a fixed morality, whether we can establish knowledge about things that are outside of temporality. And so I was going to go into the Kalam cosmological argument, but I think that's best left into the question and answer session, where Dan and I can actually sort of have that more robust discussion about God and the nature of science. Thank you very much.
So now we'll get into the cross-examination of the debate. So I'll try to keep it at 20 minutes, and this will basically be each speaker asking the other speaker a question on what they just presented, and then there'll be a little bit of back and forth. Now, unfortunately, we only have one of these things, so we'll make do. Same thing happened in the last debate, and everything was fine, so this time will be fine as well. And if you guys notice, I have that up there. Now, after this cross-examination, we're going to have Q&A, where you will be given the opportunity to ask a question if you raise your hand. But if you do want to ask anonymously, then that's my number, no funny stuff. Just ask. First, have the name of the Dan or Ragib that you want to ask the question to, and then write your question, right? If you don't have their names and I see your question, it's not going to be a part of the event, right? So first put the name of the speaker and then put your question. Try not to make it too long, and then and proceed like that. So so let's start. So since Dan opened, Ragib's going to ask the first question. So here you go.
So Dan, you raised this idea of evolution, and I'm gonna get started with that one. Basically, wait, did it have to be questions, or because he raised certain points? Can we just go? Yeah, let's just go. Basically, my understanding of the consequences of theory of evolution on my particular faith is really quite minimal, right? Because for me, it's a question of how science establishes truth and how truths are established for my religion. If truths for my religion are established because A, I'm rationally convinced that there must be a creator, and B, I am rationally convinced that this creator must have sent a particular divine revelation, then whatever truths come out of science, it's almost like, well, I'm just going to let science do what science does, right? Science does an amazing job of figuring out how the temporal world works. It's doing breakthrough, groundbreaking understanding of the reality that we have. But that's not going to affect certain tenets that I have, because and like I said in the talk, there's a difference between necessary truths and the truths that science posit, which are fundamentally contingent on senses, contingent on experimentation, and always, and science itself is very open to this, which is revision, right? Our faith, by definition, in terms of what we believe as sort of the tenets, are not subject to that kind of revision. So I guess that'll start.
Yeah, wow. So a lot of different angles to take that question, I think. And it might get difficult for you, because I feel like it might have to go back and forth so I can clarify some points as I continue to ask. So I guess if you're saying that science can't come up with something that changes the core tenets of these absolute truths that religion provides, I guess the main thing that comes to mind there is, what do we do when we have multiple faiths that all claim to have these absolute truths, and we can't use science to readjust those? It seems like we're in a bit of a bind there. And then it seems like you say that science deals with contingent truths, which I agree in the sense that I talked about, that it's relative to levels of certainty. No one in science is saying, we know this for sure, we know because we looked at 10,000 geese that they're all white, right? Because we only saw 10,000 out of a sample size of 5 billion, we're gonna have error bars of a certain length. And science is open to correction like that. So I guess my question is, what do we do in religion if there's no science to falsify it? What do we do when we have competing ideas? What do we do when my testimony says there is no God? And I'm not making a scientific claim, but I'm making a faith-based one. How do we go about that? And my only idea I can come to is that we have to appeal to these scientific epistemological values of evidence, of reasoning, rationality, all these things. So I guess I just don't know how you are going to reconcile a version of evolution that says specifically there can't be first humans, and then you can't have a gradual soul, and you have to justify where God inserted a soul, etc. So yeah, I guess your response.
Just responding to the question that you had, specifically about science's role in sort of determining evolution. Look, I'm going to be straight up honest with you, right? It makes very little difference to me, right? As someone someone believing in Islam as a religion, right? What exactly the scientific community comes to a consensus about, right? And that's, I guess that sounds kind of like as if I don't care about the knowledge. It's not that. It's not that I don't care about the knowledge that they're producing. It's more so that I came to my faith. Well, obviously there's the element of by birth, but there's also several tenets that came that sort of made it clear for me why I should be a Muslim as opposed to believing in other gods, right? So, for example, we study in Aqidah that the element of unity in the divine is something of paramount importance, right? That if there is something that created the universe, there cannot be multiple agents of that particular creation. And there's a elaborate argument for that. And so that pretty much nullifies how the modern understanding of Christianity, which is based on a trifold divine agency, and so that's a very easy that's a very, very easy reason for me to say that's why I'm not a Christian, right? Well, yes, I'm not Jewish because you can't really enter into that particular religion in that way. And so I believe that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the last prophet. And you look at the revelation that he sent out and the Quranic text that he sent out, and that particular moral guidance that comes out of a text like that, that particular system that I look at as a cohesive whole, as a way of living life. I look at all of these elements, and really I can't find any other religion that sort of gives me that particular certainty that 100% is satisfy the rational elements of what it means to believe in a God, and obviously the other elements which are important to me, having the right morality and so forth.
Yeah, I think I understand where you're coming from, and I'm lucky in a weird sense to be able to reflect back on when I used to believe in God. And I think when I started to transition, of course, some people have these revelatory moments like, aha, Dawkins had a one-liner, right? That wasn't how it worked for me. And I think as I saw things, it started to instill doubt. And as I read more, the doubt grew. So I guess the question comes to be, I totally understand that even if you have a scientific consensus on evolution, that there's still enough evidence for the proof of Allah that wouldn't, you would just presume that it's figured out somehow. You may not understand why, but just because this seems contradictory, it doesn't trump the Kalam cosmological argument and all these others, right? And that's fine, but that would still have to mean there's at least a level of evidence, right? If there's the Quran, which claims to be the perfect word of God, if it says, this is not a metaphor, man and woman were made from dust, and then we have evolution, to me, you have to beg the question, which is to presuppose God exists and then try and explain it away. When you can at least admit, and I think what you might be doing subtly is that it does seem that evolution isn't indicative of it. But would you say it's just not sufficient evidence to make you question it, in a legitimate way? Does that make sense?
I'm sorry.
So you would agree, like, if every line in the Quran was just logically wrong according to scientific consensus, you would start to hesitate, right? Because if not, then there's no arguing against anyone. It's like, I know Jesus didn't exist, but I'm still a Christian. There's no way to get around that if you don't have any logical baselines, right? So is there a level of evidence that would at least make you doubt or hesitate and potentially change? And if so, why would you say that evidence, like scientific evidence, empirical things, why would that trump faith-based claims and testimony?
Just so you get a fair amount of time to ask a question, you can respond to this one, and then if you want to continue with this,
Sure.
then you can do that, or if you want to ask another one, then you can do that as well.
Stop interrupting us, bro. Alright. We've got something good here. Man, you're really good at asking good questions. Here is, I guess, my best shot at sort of an answer. And I'm the first to sort of admit that this might not be the perfect answer. But the answer that I would have is that I'm really grateful that the Quran does not posit at every sentence something that everything and the reality around me tells me is wrong, right? There are very few, like, there are certain things that I guess I need clarified, but I haven't come to any, because the Quran is not a text on reality, right? It's largely speaking a text on, how the importance of being wary of a divine element, the importance of being aware of an afterlife, the importance of being good, the importance of what is the good, the importance of anchoring the good on something external to you, the importance of, fighting oppression. These are the elements that a text is actually there for, right? Most of the elements of what the Quran is and the Hadith are, they are largely speaking, they're not bodies of text that are there to give us what is and is not. They are there to give us what ought to be and what shouldn't ought to be, right? That's the large corpus of it, right? And so when the Quran tells us in a particular way how God actually created us, and if it's literal, then I affirm it, right? There's absolutely no question about it. Because that's part of if I believe that rationally speaking God must have been the divine author of this particular text, it doesn't matter what's the rest of my reasoning telling me. It doesn't matter what anyone else is telling me, because the agency of whatever God's reasoning is, the logos out there that he instructs us, is far outweighs in epistemological terms anything that we can sort of conceive of in reality. And I get comfort from the fact that, look, the Quran doesn't try really that hard to try and, give an explicit account of exactly how creation came to be, exactly which specific date and how the elements of the soul. These elements, we have a particular story on how it happened, which is God created Adam, and then he breathed a soul into Adam, and that gave life, and they were in heaven. And it's basically just, it's not that different to the Christian one, except we don't necessarily say that Eve was the full problem of that. But other than that, it's not a text on what is. It's not a text on reality. It's fundamentally a text on how we ought to live our lives. And so for the elements of the text that give us clear indication about how man was created, you can hit me with all the evidence of scientific reasoning you want. I'd just be like, look, I'm sure your progress of science needs to continue and keep doing it, right? It's not going to ever shake a faith because, and I guess this is what makes a lot of Muslim friends that I kind of, in my circle anyway, like, we don't talk about evolution. It's just like, oh yeah, it's probably true. If it's true, it's not a big deal, right? Because our faith is so much higher than that. Our faith kind of, it's not contingent on those kinds of facts.
Yeah, I guess I can just sum up in I guess just my general view as an atheist, and I think a lot of atheists just have this issue, is when your faith can't be shaken by these facts. We don't know what other source we have to correct people that are wrong, because we know all the faiths can't be correct. And if we can't use logic and say, okay, your faith/culture tells you to live this way, if we can't look at all the societies that had this government or this style of laws or those commandments, if we can't show by some third source why that's wrong, well, then we're just left with no conversation to be had. That's just my general take for atheists with that. But I think we can relate it to that. I just wanted to give my general perception of your presentation, because I think you said a lot of things and I found myself agreeing with most of them. I just didn't find that was a worry that I had. So when you talked about science having a monopoly on legitimate knowledge and science whores itself to the highest bidder, I'm not sure I've actually ever heard a scientist that would deny that there are massive issues in academia, the way that funding is distributed. And particularly atheists have issues with the Templeton Foundation in the US. That is, the goal of John Templeton, who founded it, was to promote the compatibility of religion and science. And you see the only papers that seem to get funded about proving libertarian free will is all funded by the Templeton Foundation. I think everyone admits that those issues are in science. There's no denying that. And then you gave a few examples where science has done bad things. And I guess my issue there is just like religion, it's not science that's doing these bad things, it's the people using it. Science is a tool how we come to facts. The person who has really good at chemistry and nuclear physics, he's not necessarily at fault for the explosion of atom bombs, more so than he is for the drones. And it's the same for architecture, is not at fault for the building of gas chambers, right? These things can be used in certain ways outside of science. So to me, that's just an issue the way religion is used. And I would never feel comfortable characterizing religion based on the bad actors and the people, you know, who claim to be using religion and doing atrocious things, right? So I think that's just important to recognize. Like, to me, there are the issues in science, but the way we're handling it. Yeah, so I guess if you want to respond to that.
100%. No, this is awesome because here's my sort of contention. My contention is, and I am going to use the example of things being done badly in the name of religion. I think just I guess the first stereotypical example would be ISIS, that we've seen the growth of and the death of in the Iraqi community, in the Iraqi region. Look, the atrocities that happen in the name of Muslims, right? I have very, very clear reasoning as to why I can say that these are misappropriations, right? Because I can say, you know what? The way in which they've established their governance, the way in which they've established their legal laws, these are wrong because they don't have they're not in line with the scholarly consensus of what the rest of the Islamic scholars say on this and this issue, right? I can, and that's within the religion itself, contained within my framework of how I see the world. I can point to exactly whatever elements of bad Muslims there are, and I don't like doing it, obviously, because Muslims shouldn't be at a position where the onus is on every single person to clarify whoever does some bad thing. That's not what I'm saying. But from a purely academic point of view, I can actually point to a particular government that's been abusing the religion, or a particular past actor, or even a current actor that's done something bad, and say, you know what, they're not just misappropriating religion. They aren't the religion because they don't satisfy XYZ criteria. And all I'm saying is that science and the scientific methodology has no way of doing that. And it doesn't need to, because I don't think its methodology is rooted in an attempt to try and find what is and isn't the right thing to do. Science requires an established ideology that ideally is safe, right, for it to function in a healthy way. And so I guess the reason I was criticizing that is because really to raise this question, raise the question about whether science should have the monopoly of the legitimate production of knowledge.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that science, at least in the sense that you were defining it as this strictly empirical testing, analysis method, I don't think anyone thinks that it should or even can have a monopoly there. And I think this is going to bring us into morality, I think, and the way that I think atheists, now of course there's a lot of infighting regarding this, but I'm very confident that a lot of the whole atheism can't be settled because we can't get an ought or how we should live. And we can get into that, but just briefly regarding science, being run by an ideology. Science, the most famous scientists of the world are the people that corrupted those ideologies. They're the people that showed, hey, the sun's not going around the earth is spinning. The earth is going around the sun is going around the galaxy. It's the people that went against. These are the most famous things, and that's why science is great, is because you can correct yourselves. If it's just a reigning ideology, there'd be no room for progress. And then at the same time, how would religion not have that same issue? Why wouldn't there just be a reigning ideology in religion, right? Especially if it appeals more to testimony, claims of the past, things like that. But yeah, with that you can respond, but otherwise I have some questions about morality as well, and I can tell you my points of view. Yeah? Okay. Okay, so morality, I'm a moral realist. Moral realism basically makes the claim that there are right and wrong answers to any given moral question. And right, this is different than absolute morality. Things are objective in the sense that they can be measured according to some outside standard. This can be done with morality. So if you look at some other, look at the game of chess, right? It's a perfectly objective game. There are right and wrong moves, right? Is there an absolute transcendent rules for this? No, we made them, right? Why didn't we make the black go first? I don't know, right? So it's not transcendent and absolute in that sense, but the game is objective. And this is the same thing for well-being, right? Morality. And my baseline for morality is the well-being of conscious creatures. These are testable claims. There's a difference between suffering, complete misery, and anything else. That is a factual claim, and I think it's really difficult for someone to try and be an epistemological skeptic and get behind the idea that there isn't. For starters, they have to hold their hand on the stove and tell me that's the case. But we know it's not. And that doesn't mean there's not going to be a situation where you have to put your hand on your stove to save your child from doing it, or you're going to have to feel pain to get pleasure by going to the gym, right? That's absolute. If you change the context of the question, the answer is going to change as well. So it's relative to the question being asked, but not relative to the sense of someone's opinion trumps another's. So for me, the issue of morality isn't any more of an issue than saying science can't deal with health. Who defines health as not vomiting all the time, right? Why not? If someone comes to you and says, my morality is not about well-being, well, we just say, okay, there's not much of a conversation to have. I don't know what else you base it on. Without well-being, we have a universe of rocks. To me, that is the most morally boring place you're ever going to find, right? So these people who come with these definitions and say, who's to say it's about this? You can play that definition game with anything, with health, with chess, with morality. That doesn't make morality not objective. And as soon as people accept that, atheists included, I'm very sorry about this because a lot of them represent me, atheists included, as soon as we accept that there are right and wrong answers to moral questions, then we can start making progress towards trying to figure out the difficult ones, like what political systems work, what religions have better effects, things like that.
We're meant to start Q&A now, but it's been a good discussion. I think we'll give it another, just like maybe back and forth once or twice more. Three, 4 minutes, and we'll get into the Q&A.
I'm glad you raised the morality point. Because, so if you are a moral realist, I take it then the well-being of the conscious creation is of paramount importance, and that all actions that promote the well-being would be the good, and all actions that prevent the well-being would be the bad. That would be like a good summary of, if I understood it correctly, yeah?
Yeah, well, I would just say net well-being. It doesn't mean that, like I said, there's going to be times where you have to suffer, right? And this is where we use the analogy of a moral landscape. So you might have to go down a peak of well-being to get to a higher peak, right? That's going to be the case, but it's net well-being. If that increases, then yes, it is morally good and you ought to do it.
It sounds suspiciously like utilitarianism.
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds very, which is that to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. Would that be correct?
Yeah, so I would consider myself a utilitarian, but I would say I don't identify as it actively just because of the misinterpretations of it, I think. The only reason, I would just say it's creating the most good. I think there's a range of experience. So if you're talking strictly about numbers, there might be a difference if you've got 5 coma patients versus one healthy person who's not on their deathbed versus 1,000 animals, right? There's going to be gradients here, but yes, overall well-being, net increase, yeah.
All right, awesome. I'm going to raise a problem that exists not necessarily in the realm of philosophy, but that actually exists in the realm of politics, right? Because this idea of the good, we live in a relatively peaceful time, and I don't say that to praise the era, because there's a lot of violence in the world. But when we look at what happened, for example, during the 2 Great World Wars, right? There is an element of violence that existed then that like for whatever reason is statistically a lower number now. Now, the human rights program, everything that you and I guess, in the context of a university environment take for granted, which is that, yeah, human beings have value, human beings are equal, there shouldn't be discrimination based on race, based on gender. all of these elements, all of these presuppositions are kind of naturalized ethics that we have, right? They're not natural. There's nothing natural about those particular forms of ethics. They have been codified after one of the greatest series of atrocities that happened during World War II. And basically an entire political system came together to try and make the argument that, we need a fixed moral set of values that we can hold states accountable to. And that became the Declaration of Human Rights, right? The Human Rights document. Now, if you are an atheist, how do you anchor the value of the human soul? Where are you getting the value of the human soul?
Just before you ask your question, because we're pretty delayed with the schedule, I don't think you can ask a question. Actually, you know what? We'll just leave it to the audience. Do you guys want to give Dan 2 minutes to respond, or should we just jump into the Q&A? Put your hands up if you want. Relax. Just calm it down. Put your hand up if you want Dan to respond in 1-2 minutes. Okay, that's consensus. It's not a democracy, by the way.
Yeah, okay, 2 minutes. So a couple things jump to mind. The first, as an atheist, which obviously this is easier to see once you're an atheist, is that the claims you seem to be making is that without this absolute morality via some sort of divine intervention, we wouldn't be able to know things right from wrong. I think, based on science, like I said before, we know well-being. These are factual claims about conscious creatures. This can be, we know this to be true, so we can say that murder is wrong. But you can run into the same issues with religion. Just because the soul is this ultimate purpose, does that mean you cannot kill in self-defense? Does it mean that you cannot go to war? These are the same type of problems you're going to deal with on a utilitarian scale, and it's going to get messy. You're going to have trolley problems, and you're going to have to justify the scope of the way you're looking at things. But they absolutely can be done. And the idea that you have to appeal to a moral authority, which I actually have my own issues with, because you can't actually know that authority is good without some outside standard. For all you know, it could be Shaitan tricking you, right? You need some outside standard to know he's good. Otherwise, you're taking an arbitrary word for it. But that's a separate issue. But yeah, utilitarian, it's going to get complicated. And the idea with equal souls and rights, again, that's, like I said, I don't actually think that's necessarily true, as crazy as that sounds. People in comas, animals, people in different states of their life, embryos, these all have different values, whether we admit it or not. The reason that we have rights and people like John Locke and all this is because we saw that if we don't make these things in practice, written down and protected, we see how things go badly. So the difference is things in practice versus things in theory. And I totally understand that a complete utilitarian mindset might lead to bad things in practice.
Okay, and with that, we'll go on to the Q&A. Sorry, nothing personal. Okay, so I think you put your hand up first. We'll go on to, who do you have the question for? Ragib, okay.
Hi, Ragib. So you said that for you, evolution, you talk about evolution, you say, oh, you like something there, and you kind of shrug it off. And it doesn't change your importance. My question to you would be why? Because considering the overwhelming support evidence for it, and the decades of empirical evidence and peer-reviewed journals from science, things like that, and just how nuanced it is, how can you shrug it off just like that when it's so contradictory to the story of Adam and Eve? And as someone who's left like religion and I'm an atheist, it really shook my kind of core tenets. So for you, why doesn't it shake your core tenets in the same way that it shook mine?
Fair enough. For me, it comes down to a question of epistemic weight, right? And we sort of, I think Dan, we reached an understanding of that point, right? Which is the epistemic weight carried by the scientific methodology carries differently when you believe in a God that's rational, and you can actually deduce via the, and we didn't get the time to actually deduce the Kalam cosmological argument, but if God rationally exists and there is rational reasons to actually believe, and it's not going to be based on evidence, and we can also establish rational by sort of a process of elimination why the Quran must have been the word of God, then it the epistemic weight of those two premises simply don't really, like, they don't carry the same epistemic value as a scientific methodology that by its very essence creates falsifiable premises.
So,
if that makes sense.
So is that an epistemic way? Is that subjective then for the person? Like, for you, it might, you say it's really kind of.
No, because I put the capacity of reason above the capacity of the sensory perceptions, right? And that's really how we measure science. We measure science mainly via the sensory perceptions, right? And so it's sort of a collation of data through the sensory perceptions. And this goes back to a kind of Cartesian point, right? In some sense, I would consider myself a Cartesian, in deducing at least that the God exists. That sensory perception has lower epistemic value than pure abstract rational deduction. I guess that's for me why any point on I think I've answered that.
Okay.
Regarding as net benefit prime, when instead of saying benefit, don't you already assume the moral framework? And if you do assume the moral framework, then why do you invoke utilitarianism? You've already assumed.
Sure. I totally get it. And I think there's a lot of confusion about utilitarianism, some of which I think I still have because I'm very novice when it comes to some of this philosophical stuff. But so yes, the moral framework that I observed and I kind of briefly laid out is that the axiom is well-being of conscious creatures. Right? If you don't accept that, then we have the conversation about an unwillingness to take a definition on something, in which case I agree nothing can be objective. Once you have that established, then I think maximizing net well-being is just a given. So this is where I think a common confusion is that utilitarianism necessarily should be juxtaposed against other moral frameworks like deontology, like virtue ethics, like all these other things. The way I actually see it is that utilitarianism, it's an umbrella term, and these other labels of, virtue ethics and deontology and all these rights and the ways to look at it, this is how we do things in practice. If you're going to say that utilitarianism, maximizing that net well-being of conscious creatures, is bad, if you're going to say that's not necessarily good, then you have to show me a situation where your moral framework admits that you could have maximized well-being of conscious creatures, but you chose to do something else, and it's good. And I've never heard a good example where that's the case. And it stands to be true even in any religious doctrine. If you are getting, some sort of divine command theory of your ethics and your morality, right, that is correct, because if it's truly God, well, then it would follow that you not doing that is bad, and it's going to lead to your eternal suffering. So you balance it, whether it's, again, any other ethical system, including religion, but the most good, the most well-being, I don't see how you can see by definition that being bad. You just add in other factors like eternal life, etc.
Okay, so I'm guessing you guys have a lot of questions because my phone is going off. We'll have, just because we are sort of really behind the schedule, you guys will have 2 minutes to respond to the questions. And there's a lot of SMS questions, so I'll just read out 2 SMS, one for you and one for you. And guys, just keep in mind, after the event, you can definitely come down and approach the speakers and further any conversations that you begun, during the debate. So, Raghib, first question for you: Is God beyond logic? Is God beyond logic? And if so, how can atheists ever disprove his existence?
I don't think to prove God, you actually need to transcend the laws of logic. In fact, I hold the laws of logic quite sacred, right? The idea that you have a proposition P and the proposition not P, and these two propositions cannot be mutually true, right? So these laws of logic that you kind of pick up, the laws of contradiction, non-contradiction, these elements are some of the bedrock frameworks for how I understand the world. Especially, as having been trained in mathematics as well, because that's basically our primary tool. To a quick summary, no, I don't think God. I think God is, in some sense, the logos that determines what is and isn't logical. And because of the perfection of the divine being, he laid out laws of logic that are very accessible to us, right? And that we don't ever need to believe anything that contravenes laws of logic. And so, I mean, I don't have, because it's a 2-minute thing, the Kalam cosmological argument takes around a good 10 minutes. And that's not what again, tonight was not about that. But to anyone who is interested, I would definitely point them towards the very rich debate that's happening between theists and atheists surrounding the Kalam cosmological argument. Because Professor William Lane Craig, as well as Hamza Zortzes, they're very, very specific in their appeal purely to reason, purely to abstract reason. And so, no, I've never seen logic sort of contravene my faith.
As you're speaking about the Kalam cosmological argument, someone actually summarized the argument and sent you a question. Whoever that was, good job. Just come down after the event has ended, and then you can discuss. I'm guessing it was you. Okay. Well, no need to apologize. So Dan, the next question is for you. There's so many. I feel bad. I'm just going the next one that came. Speaking purely in terms of philosophical possibility, do you believe the Abrahamic conception of a transcendent single God to be potentially true? Or is it irrational and impossible?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And this is one that I've often argued with my fellow atheists about, because I think sometimes they don't give it a fair due. And I stand by the fact that if it was proven to me, it would be a God that I worship. But the issue is that philosophically it is, but based on my current understanding, I see multiple, and some of them critical, logical contradictions in the descriptions and characterizations of these gods. So until that actually makes sense to my mind, I'm not in any place to say whether or not it's possible, right? Could there be a universe where there's square circles, right? I don't know, right? There's no way for me to understand that. Now, if it was laid out like God did this miracle, that miracle, and this miracle, yes, absolutely. I'm not, that's totally fine. But where there's contradictions, I'm not in a position to say whether such a thing is possible. Like he said, I hold logic to be sacred as well. And if we can't get by the logical issues, then I'm forced to say, no, it wouldn't be possible. But if there are misinterpretations, which obviously different theisms have more strict guidelines in their characterizations, yes, there is a theistic personal God, if given a proper description, could possibly exist, yeah.
Okay, awesome. So, what's so funny? Okay, never mind. So, that was it for the debate. Now we just have closing remarks. So, who wants to go first? Okay. So, just to keep this brief as well, because it's 8:30.
Yeah, fair enough. I actually want to catch up with this guy straight after, to be honest. He seems like a cool bloke, and that for me was actually one of the sort of takeaway points of the night, and that is, it was really, really refreshing to get a Muslim versus atheist debate that kind of didn't spiral out of control, because that so often happens, where you just sort of like the interlocutor is making points that are wildly out of whack, and they're not engaging. So I was really good that we sort of engaged, and I'm really happy with the kind of work that MSAs are doing in our community. So look, as a general kind of rule, as a general closing remark, I wish all you guys the best, but really, in terms of the actual topic at hand, what I hope to show was that the scientific method and the scientific epistemic basis is something that requires us to look and dig a little bit deeper, and sort of dig a little bit deeper in terms of its limits and the exact epistemic weight that we attach to scientific deductions, and sort of come to our own conclusions about how we can reconcile God with that. So that's basically it for me.
Yeah, awesome. So I didn't prognosticate that we'd actually be this rushed. So, and because this was my first formal debate, I actually wrote out my closing speech because there were a couple key points that I really wanted to make sure that we hit and we got takeaways from tonight. So this might take me about 5 minutes to read. I'll try not to rush too far, but if you guys can indulge for another 5 minutes. So for starters, yes, I just want to say thank you again to UNSW MSA for hosting tonight's debate, as well as all the other great events that they've had throughout the rest of Islamic Awareness Week, particularly the free camel burgers. They were awesome. And perhaps more importantly, thank you guys to the audience tonight for coming out. I mean, I think you guys are really fueling this discussion around these big issues. So to start things off, I just wanted to say a few perspectives regarding science and the way it should be looked at, which I hope I've shown to be justified through tonight's debate. So in Sean Carroll's book, Does the Universe Need God? He says, science isn't in the business of proving things. Rather, science judges the merits of competing models in terms of their simplicity, clarity, comprehensiveness, and fit to the data. Unsuccessful theories are never disproven, as we can always concoct elaborate schemes to save the phenomena. They just fade away as better theories gain acceptance. Further, science admits that we don't know, and we make models that fit the data to the best of our ability and try our best to improve our technological capacity to continue testing and refining them. We don't say, therefore God, we don't need to fill the gap with a being, particularly a being who shares countless similarities with the myriad of religious gods we've seen humans and tribes make and worship for centuries on end. Science is honest about that. While religion obviously affects culture and ways of life, there are no Hindu sciences, Christian sciences, or Islamic sciences. This is because science, as a methodology for acquiring truth, is the universal baseline we have for investigating the veracity of claims made about reality. When there are conflicts in faith claims, we appeal to evidence and credibility, using what we have learned through science. And when we do trust professional scientists, it's not an issue of faith, which is too often the equivocation that's made. While religious authorities are often those who know the most about previous religious authorities from prior generations, scientific authorities like Einstein, we recognize as someone who understands the data and its implications. I don't have the mind to understand a four-dimensional space and its various implications for general and special relativity, but I can point to a peer review process that justifies my trust in the claims, not my faith in them. And as I wrap this up, I want to again appeal to the purpose of tonight's debate. I didn't come up here with any disillusion that I would convert a bunch of Muslims to atheism. This is a misunderstanding of what atheism and its goals are, as it so commonly and ironically is treated as a religion in and of itself. Atheism is the lack of belief in a God, particularly a personal God. It is quite akin to any Muslim's lack of belief in Jesus as the Son of God, or any theist's lack of belief in Zeus controlling the thunder in the sky. As Matt Dillahunty says, atheism does not seek to abolish religion or convert believers to the other side like most evangelical religions. Instead, as atheists, we try to promote intellectual honesty and justified skepticism, a fortunate byproduct of which will be the progressive disintegration of religion and other dogmatic beliefs. And this isn't to say...
Whoa.
Yeah, it's only been 3 minutes, no?
Keep one by the way. 30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. All right, I might just wing it from here then. Yeah, so I'm one of 5 kids, and I was a Christian for 23 years. And I realized when I started to have doubts and learn more that I was going to have to give up part of my identity, and that was daunting. But what I also realized is that I would simultaneously form a new identity, and I would now be the guy who was religious and prayed every night and went to church every week, and now I was no longer convinced of these things, right? And these are things we need to take seriously. So as Muslims in the room, make sure you call out your fellow Muslims when they're right about something but for the wrong reasons. And atheists in the rooms, try and figure out where you guys are going wrong. Don't only watch Sam Harris Destroys videos, right? Go back, read Aquinas, read Aristotle, watch Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. Go through all of this stuff, and that's the only way that we're ever going to come to a consensus and make progress in this stuff. So thank you guys for coming out.
Really hated to do that, but thank you, Dan, and thank you, Raghu. This is actually the first time both of them have been in a formal debate, and to be honest, I think that was better than most of the debates that I've seen happen in the past. Can we just get another round of applause for them? And we also have a small gift for you guys from our societies. So can we first get Akhlaq on behalf of the MSA? Can you please give the gift? And Lisa on behalf of UAAH. Okay, so that concludes our event.